It was 12:30 in the afternoon, a mild Wednesday in January. The kind of winter day in Boston that feels like an unexpected gift. Temperatures climbing above 40 degrees. The streets of the North End busy with workers on lunch break. Horses pulling carts across cobblestones. Children weaving between adults on the sidewalks of Commercial Street. The elevated railway ran overhead, its iron supports casting thin shadows on the pavement below. At the firehouse on the corner, a group of men had just sat down to play cards and eat their midday meal. At the city's paving yard nearby, laborers were taking their break in the open air, grateful for the warmth. None of them heard it coming. By the time the sound registered, a low rumble, like a freight train approaching, then a crack, then a roar, unlike anything they had language for. The wall of molasses was already in the street. It was 15 feet high in places, 160 feet wide, moving at 35 miles per hour through one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the city. 2.5 million gallons of thick, dark, industrial-grade molasses, driven by its own weight and the pressure of months of accumulated structural failure, erasing everything in the first 2 city blocks before most people had processed the fact that they were in danger. 21 people died, 150 were injured, 12 horses were killed where they stood. The city of Boston smelled of molasses on hot summer days for decades afterward, and the reason none of it had to happen. The reason every death that afternoon was preventable, documented, and the direct result of deliberate choices made by a corporation that had watched its tank fail on these findings, site for 3 years and decided that the cost of fixing it was not worth the disruption to production, is the story this video is going to tell in full. Because the tank had been leaking since the day it was built. Because the company knew. Because they painted it brown, so the leaks would not be visible. And because the neighborhood they built it in, a neighborhood of Italian and Irish immigrant workers, with no political power, no legal standing, and no platform from which to make themselves heard, was not a coincidence. It was a calculation. The story begins, not in 1919, but in 1915, in the middle of a war that was transforming the American industrial economy at a pace that existing infrastructure could not keep up with. The United States entered the First World War, formally, in 1917, but American industry had been supplying munitions to Allied powers since the conflict began in 1914. One of the key ingredients in the manufacture of smokeless powder, dynamite, and other military explosives was industrial alcohol, specifically the kind that could be distilled from fermented molasses. Demand for industrial alcohol exploded alongside the demand for weapons. Companies with the capacity to produce it at scale were printing money. The Purity Distilling Company, based in Boston, was one of them. It had a distillery in Cambridge. What it needed was storage. Specifically, it needed a place to hold the enormous quantities of raw molasses being shipped from the Caribbean before they could be transported to the distillery for processing. The location they chose was 529 Commercial Street in Boston's North End. The North End was, and remains, one of the oldest and most densely settled neighborhoods in the city. In 1915, it was home to a large population of Italian immigrants, many of whom had arrived in the previous 2 decades and who occupied the lower rungs of Boston's economic and political ladder. They were working people, most of them poor, most of them without American citizenship, most of them in no position to oppose the decisions of a corporation backed by wartime government contracts and the implicit endorsement of an economy that valued their labor but not their lives. Only approximately 25% of the Italian-born residents of the North End in 1919 held American citizenship. This was not an accident of administrative delay. It was the specific legal reality of an immigrant population that had not yet completed the naturalization process. In many cases, because the naturalization process was inaccessible to people working 12-hour days in industrial jobs for wages that left nothing for legal fees or paperwork. Without citizenship, you could not vote. Without votes, you had no political leverage over the decisions that your city's politicians made about where to place industrial infrastructure. USIA did not conduct a community consultation before erecting a 50-foot industrial tank full of molasses in the middle of a residential neighborhood. No environmental review was required. No neighborhood notification was mandated by law. The company identified a site near the waterfront and the elevated railway, logistically ideal for receiving shipments from the harbor and loading them onto rail cars, and they built. The politics of the North End's Italian immigrant community were, in 1915, a practical irrelevance to everyone involved. The tank went up in the winter of 1915. It was enormous, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, capable of holding more than 2.5 million gallons of liquid. It was built quickly, in approximately 6 months, because the war needed alcohol, and the war was not going to wait for a careful engineering review. The urgency was not metaphorical. Industrial alcohol was a primary input for the production of smokeless powder, cordite, and other explosive compounds that the Allied militaries were consuming at industrial scale in the trenches of the Western Front. Every week of delay in expanding production capacity was, in the framework of wartime economics, a measurable loss. USIA's contracts with the federal government were substantial. The company's revenue had roughly doubled in the years since the war began. Speed was not merely encouraged, it was the governing value around which every other consideration was arranged. There was also a second urgency that historians have noted with particular interest. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratifying prohibition, was scheduled for ratification. It was ratified, in fact, on January 16, 1919, the day after the flood. The manufacture of industrial alcohol was exempt from prohibition, but the industry landscape was about to change dramatically. Some accounts suggest that USIA and Purity were in the final stages of converting as much raw molasses into finished alcohol as possible before the regulatory environment shifted. Whether the specific decision to fill the tank to near capacity with a fresh, large shipment 3 days before the disaster was connected to this timing, historians cannot say definitively. What they can say is that by January 12, 1919, the tank held 3 million gallons of molasses,
This exhibit
a load that had
captures
only
the
reached that
moment
level 3
82
times
million
before
tons of
in
rock
4 years of
broke free,
operation, and that the
burying the
18th
town of
Amendment
Frank
became
in
law the
moments.
following day. The man overseeing construction was Arthur Gell, the treasurer of United States Industrial Alcohol, the parent company that had acquired Purity Distilling. Arthur Gell had no architectural training, no engineering training, no background in construction or materials science. He was an accountant who had been handed responsibility for a major industrial construction project in the middle of a crowded residential neighborhood, because getting the tank built fast was the priority, and qualifications were a secondary consideration. Gell did not fill the tank with water to test it before putting it into service. This was not some obscure or exotic testing protocol. It was the standard industry practice for verifying that a large liquid storage container could
The
hold what it was
displacement
designed
readings
to
on the
hold
upper
without
fissure are
leaking
climbing.
or deforming.
I see it.
Fill it with water first.
But the internal
Check for
velocity
leaks.
sensors show
Fix them.
stable movement
Then
for
fill
now.
it with the actual product. Gell skipped this step entirely. In its place, he added a mere few inches of water, nowhere near enough to stress test the walls, and declared the tank operational. The first delivery of molasses arrived on December 31st, 1915. Almost immediately, the tank began to leak. Not in a subtle way, not in the way that might require sophisticated instrumentation to detect. The tank leaked visibly, consistently, in quantities that were apparent to anyone who walked past it on Commercial Street. Dark ribbons of molasses ran down the tank's exterior walls and pooled at the base. The seams where the steel plates met were weeping. The rivets, already improperly spaced and misaligned during construction, as later engineering analysis would confirm, were not holding the walls together with anything approaching the integrity the design required. When workers came to Gell with fragments of cracked steel they had pulled from the tank's walls, showing him physical evidence of structural failure, he reportedly told them, "I don't know what you want me to do. The tank still stands.
Be sure
The
to
tank still
document the
stands."
striations on
That
this face.
phrase, that
must
specific
understand the
logic,
mechanism.
is the operating philosophy that killed 21 people on the afternoon of January 15, 1919. The company's response to the visible leaking was not to repair the tank or reduce the loads on it or commission an engineering assessment of its structural integrity. The company's response was to paint the exterior of the tank brown, not industrial gray, not the standard safety color of a commercial storage facility. Brown, the specific, deliberate shade of dark brown that most closely matched the color of leaking molasses, chosen to make the leaks invisible to casual observation so that neither regulatory bodies nor neighborhood residents nor visiting USDA food safety inspectors who came daily but to check the quality of the molasses for food use, not the structural integrity of the tank that held it, would see anything worth reporting. Local children collected the leaked molasses in cups and cans. Their parents used it in their cooking. The sweet smell of it hung over the northern blocks of Commercial Street every day for 4 years. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the tank was leaking. Everyone in the neighborhood had learned to live with the groaning sounds it made when a fresh load was pumped in. Everyone.
The key difference in the contemporary
except the people who
assessment
could have
lies
done
in
something
how we
about it.
integrate the
Purity
seismic
Distilling
data
was
with the
purchased by United
historical
States
topographical
Industrial
maps
Alcohol,
from 1903.
USIA,
The
in
displacement readings
1917,
near the fault
deepening
line
the
are
corporate
escalating
distance
faster than
between the
projected.
decision
We
makers
must
and the
ensure the
neighborhood they had
transmission model
decided
is
to put the
robust
tank
enough
in.
for the other regions.
USIA was not a Purity operation. It was a major industrial corporation serving federal government contracts. The war needed more alcohol, so the tank needed to hold more molasses. So deliveries grew in size, and the loads on the tank's already failing walls grew with them. On January 12, 1919, 3 days before the disaster, the ship Maliro arrived in Boston Harbor from Cuba, carrying a fresh load of warmer molasses. Workers pumped 1.3 million gallons of this warm Caribbean molasses into a tank that already contained colder Boston winter molasses. The warm material rose to the top. The cold material sat below. The temperature difference between layers accelerated fermentation. Fermentation produces carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide inside a sealed metal container creates pressure. The tank now held 2.3 million gallons of liquid at near maximum capacity, a load it had been pushed to only 4 times in 4 years. In a structure whose steel walls were half as thick as they should have been, whose rivets had been improperly installed, whose manganese content was insufficient for cold weather, brittleness, resistance, and whose seams had been visibly leaking for 3 years. And on January 15, 1919, the temperature in Boston rose rapidly from near freezing overnight lows to above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, causing thermal expansion in both the tank's steel walls and the molasses inside them. At 12:30 in the afternoon, something in that accumulation of failures reached its terminal point. Witnesses described hearing a sound like a machine gun first, a rapid-fire series of sharp metallic reports as the rivets blew out of the tank's walls, one by one. Then in cascades, the half-inch steel rivets that had been holding 2 million gallons of molasses in place tore free from their holes and launched into the air at bullet-like velocity. Rivet fragments pierced the steel girders of the elevated railway overhead. Some traveled hundreds of feet. Then the wall itself gave way. A massive section of the tank's lower structure fractured and collapsed outward, and the contents of the tank, driven by the weight of 3 million gallons of molasses and the explosive pressure of the fermentation gases above them, hit the street. The wave was, by contemporary accounts, between 15 and 40 feet high at its peak, 160 feet wide, traveling at 35 miles an hour. The Boston Post reported the following day that the sight that greeted rescue workers on the scene was almost indescribable. Molasses waist deep in the streets, swirling around the wreckage, with forms visible within it that rescuers could not at first identify as human or animal. The men who had been eating lunch at the Engine 31 firehouse never had a chance to move. The building was struck directly, lifted partway off its foundation, and partially collapsed around them. 3 firemen died. 5 workers from the city paving yard who had been on their lunch break in the open air were engulfed and drowned. A group of young boys, children of the neighborhood, had been near the base of the tank when it blew. None of them survived the initial wave. The elevated railway support column closest to the tank was struck by a section of tank wall large enough to buckle the steel girder. A streetcar was thrown from the tracks. Train operator Royal Albert Lamont, recognizing that the tracks ahead were destroyed, brought his car to an emergency stop with seconds to spare, preventing an entire trainload of passengers from plunging into the molasses below. An 8-year-old girl named Maria Di was swept away from the street while playing. Her body was not recovered for hours. A teamster named George Leahy, who had been working with his cart horse on Commercial Street, was found buried in molasses alongside his horse. Both had drowned. The rescue operation that followed was one of the most physically brutal in Boston's history, not because of the scale of destruction, but because of what molasses does when it is cold. The Harvard University team that conducted a comprehensive scientific analysis of the disaster nearly a century later, in 2016, confirmed what rescue workers discovered through terrible direct experience in 1919. As the molasses spread from the warm tank out into the cold January air of Boston streets, it rapidly increased in viscosity, a substance that had been moving at 35 miles an hour as a fluid began to thicken and set as it cooled. To understand why the molasses moved so fast and then became so lethal as it slowed, you have to understand something about the physics of non-Newtonian fluids, which is essentially what molasses at varying temperatures behaves like. When the tank failed, the molasses inside was warm, having been mixed with the fresh Caribbean shipment just 3 days prior. Warm molasses is relatively thin. It flows. It accelerates under gravity, with 2-3 million gallons of liquid driving from behind. The front of the wave had enormous kinetic energy. Witnesses on the street said the initial rush hit them before they could process.
By 1905,
the roar that
the
preceded
resilient
it,
town of
a brownish-black wall moving with the speed and force
New
of a breaking ocean
structures rose from
wave,
the debris.
carrying debris from the shattered tank walls, buckled steel plates, snapped wooden structures, and whatever physical objects were in the street. The initial impact was not a drowning. It was a collision. Buildings were not flooded. They were struck. Walls collapsed inward. The firehouse was not submerged. It was pushed. Vehicles were not covered. They were thrown. And then the temperature took over. Because Boston in January is cold. The 60-degree differential between the warm molasses emerging from the tank and the ambient winter air caused the outer edges of the flood to begin setting almost immediately as the waves spread outward. By the time rescue workers arrived, the naval cadets first, then firemen, then police, then Red Cross volunteers, the area 2 blocks from the tank was not a liquid. It was a semi-solid brown field, knee-deep in places, waist-deep in others, with a texture somewhere between cold corn syrup and wet concrete. Every step into it required enormous effort to extract. Every victim who had been knocked down by the wave and was still alive was being held in an increasingly immobile grip by a substance that pressed against their chest and neck with the weight of its own viscosity. The Harvard study concluded that most victims did not drown in the conventional sense. They suffocated, unable to lift their chests against the pressure of cooling molasses that surrounded them. By the time rescue workers arrived, many of the victims were not drowning in a liquid. They were being compressed by something closer to coal tar, a substance so viscous that it held people immobile while they suffocated, and that clung to the boots and legs of every person who attempted to wade into it to help. Rescuers sank into it. Firemen had to be pulled free by their colleagues. The Red Cross volunteers who arrived to assist became stuck themselves. The 116 naval cadets from the nearby training vessel, USS Nantucket, who were the first organized rescue force on the scene, worked in shifting pairs, each man holding the other to keep from being swallowed, passing victims hand over hand toward the edge of the flood zone. The Boston harbor ran brown with molasses until summer. The salt water that Boston fireboat operators eventually pumped over the debris to dissolve the molasses, having discovered that fresh water did nothing, but salt water cut through it, turned Commercial Street into a brown slick that workmen spent weeks scrubbing from every surface. Decades later, residents reported that on particularly hot days, the sweet smell of molasses still rose from the cracks in the pavement of the North End. The disaster became embedded not just in the neighborhood's memory, but in its physical substrate. Boston could not forget it, because Boston was literally still made of it. In the immediate aftermath, USIA's lawyers did something that tells you everything you need to know about the culture of corporate accountability in 1919. They blamed anarchists. This was not a careless accusation or an off-the-cuff deflection. It was a deliberate legal strategy, chosen for very specific reasons. The year was 1919. The first Red Scare was in full swing, and fear of Bolshevik and anarchist violence was near its peak in American public life. Just weeks earlier, in December 1918, a bomb had exploded at a police station in the North End. In the spring of 1919, anarchist mail bombs would be sent to 36 prominent American citizens. USIA's lawyers understood the political landscape and weaponized it by claiming that anarchists had bombed the tank in protest against USIA's role in weapons production. They positioned the corporation as a victim of radical violence rather than the perpetrator of industrial negligence. And they specifically blamed Italian anarchists, linking the disaster to the immigrant community whose neighborhoods surrounded the tank, whose children had died in the flood, and whose political powerlessness made them a safe target for a misdirection campaign. The strategy required a complete fabrication. There was no explosion inside the tank. There was no bomb. The tank failed from within. From the accumulated stress of 3 years of overloading a structurally deficient container that had been built in 6 months by an accountant with no engineering qualifications and filled beyond its safe capacity the day before it collapsed, every piece of physical evidence pointed to structural failure. USIA spent more than $50,000 on expert witnesses to argue otherwise. They hired the best lawyers available. They produced the longest legal proceeding in Massachusetts history at the time, and still, they lost. The case that 119 North End residents brought against USIA, one of the first major class action lawsuits in Massachusetts legal history, produced a proceeding that lasted 6 years, drew testimony from more than 3,000 witnesses, generated 45,000 pages of documents, and required 11 weeks just for closing arguments. A court-appointed auditor named Hugh W. Ogden, a veteran of the First World War and a man of formidable institutional reputation, sifted through all of it. He rejected the anarchist theory without equivocation. He found that the tank had collapsed due to structural failure caused by negligence in its original design and construction. He found that USIA had known the tank was problematic and had done nothing meaningful to address it. On April 28, 1925, 6 years and 3 months after the flood, he issued his ruling. USIA was responsible. The company ultimately paid $628,000 in damages, approximately $11 to $12 million in today's money. Relatives of those killed received around $7,000 per victim. $7,000 per person for a death that happened because a corporation painted its leaking tank brown and decided the neighborhood, whose residents would die in the flood, was not the kind of neighborhood that would stop them. What the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 produced, beyond the bodies and the lawsuits and the settlements, was something that had not previously existed in American civil engineering: mandatory licensing for engineers and architects. Boston's response to the disaster included a new requirement that all major construction projects be reviewed and signed off by licensed engineers before construction began, a practice that spread across the country in the following decades, and that forms the regulatory foundation of modern construction safety.
The displacement readings on the upper fissure are climbing.
A corporation could hire an accountant to build a 50-foot industrial tank in a residential neighborhood and be under no legal obligation to have it reviewed by anyone who actually understood structural engineering. After that date, in Boston, at least, that was no longer the case. The disaster also produced something in the realm of corporate law that was arguably more consequential than any engineering reform. The precedent that a large corporation could be held directly, financially responsible for the deaths caused by its negligence, even when that corporation had the resources to fight the case for 6 years, and the political connections to attempt a scapegoat. The class action lawsuit against USIA was not the first corporate liability case in American history, but it was among the most prominent, and the sheer scale of the preceding 3,000 witnesses, 45,000 pages, 6 years of hearings, made its outcome impossible to ignore. You could not easily argue, after Doar v. United States Industrial Alcohol, that corporations were merely neutral parties to the conditions in which their workers and neighbors lived and died. You could not argue, at least not without the explicit counter-evidence of that ruling, that the paint on the outside of a leaking tank was a private matter with no public consequence. The north end of Boston today is one of the most visited neighborhoods in the city. Tourists come for the Italian restaurants, the bakeries, the pastry shops, the historical architecture. The neighborhood's commercial identity has been thoroughly reconstructed around the culinary culture of the Italian immigrant community that Asia chose precisely because it could not fight back. At the entrance to Popolo Park, on Commercial Street, in the neighborhood where the molasses killed 21 people, there is a small plaque. It was placed by the Bostonian Society. It is not large. It does not dominate the landscape the way the tank once did. It commemorates what happened on January 15, 1919, and names the people who died there. The tank itself was never rebuilt. The site is now a public park. But here is the thing about the Great Molasses Flood that stays with you. The thing that makes it more than a remarkable anecdote in the history of American industrial disasters. It is not ultimately a story about molasses. The molasses is the detail that makes it memorable, that makes people stop, register, surprise, feel the particular disorientation of something absurd and terrible occupying the same event simultaneously.
The key difference in the contemporary assessment lies in how we integrate the seismic data with the historical topographical maps from 1903.
In a neighborhood specifically chosen because the people who lived there could not effectively object. What produced it was the decision to leave the tank in service for 3 years after it became clear it was failing. Because the war needed alcohol, and the alcohol needed molasses, and the molasses needed a tank. And the people in the street below the tank were not the people making the decisions. What produced it was the paint job, the deliberate, documented, corporate decision to make the evidence of structural failure invisible by matching the color of the evidence to the color of the structure that contained it. Painting the tank brown did not hide the leak from the people who lived on Commercial Street. They saw the molasses running down the walls every day. The children collected it. The adults smelled it. The neighborhood knew the paint was not for the neighborhood. The paint was for the inspectors, the auditors, the regulatory bodies, anyone with institutional authority who might look at the tank from the outside and decide that the leak warranted intervention. The paint was the company's way of conducting its primary safety protocol, which was, make sure no one with power to stop you can see what you already know. That protocol failed, eventually, in a court of law 6 years after the flood, but it succeeded for 3 years before the flood. And in those 3 years, on 2.5 million gallons of accumulated negligence, 21 people went to work, or to school, or to lunch on a mild January Wednesday, and none of them came home. There is a phrase in the history of the engineering profession, an axiom that appears in virtually every account of large structural failures. From the Tay Bridge in Scotland, to the Tacoma Narrows, to every collapsing balcony, and buckling dam, and fractured pipeline that has killed people who trusted the thing they were standing on, or near, to hold. The phrase is, the tank still stands, not literally, but as a logic. The logic that says, this evidence of failure is not yet catastrophic enough to require action. The logic that says, the cost of addressing the problem now exceeds the cost of leaving it until it forces itself upon us. The logic that is wrong every single time it is applied, and that is applied every single time someone in authority looks at a piece of cracked steel, or a leaking seam, or a warning from a maintenance worker, and decides that doing nothing is the more economically defensible option. Arthur Gell said it directly, with genuine transparency. When a laborer put cracked steel fragments from the molasses tank on his desk, as physical evidence that the structure was failing. The tank still stands. This was his honest, unembellished assessment of the situation. It has not yet stopped standing. Therefore, I am not yet required to act. 3 years, and 2 months later, it stopped standing. In 30 seconds, give or take, and the 30-5-mile-hour wave of consequence rolled through the north end. And it didn't distinguish between the people who had built the tank and the people who happened to be standing near it when it let go. The people who happened to be standing near it were the ones who paid. The people who had built it paid $628,000. 6 years later, in a settlement that closed the case and put the flood into legal history and allowed the company to move on, Boston continued to smell of molasses on hot days for decades. Because some things, when they are deep enough in the ground and the walls and the memory of a neighborhood, cannot be fully cleaned out. You can scrub the cobblestones with salt water. You can tear down the tank and build a park in its place. You can put a small plaque at the entrance. But the 35-mile-an-hour wave already went through. The 21 people are still dead. The neighborhood's children still grew up knowing that the company had painted the tank brown and decided that was enough. If this story changed the way you understand what negligence actually means, not as an accident, not as an oversight, but as a decision made by people who knew and chose not to act, drop the word molasses in the comments. I want to know who made it to the end of this one. Because the people who understand that the paint job on a leaking tank is not a safety protocol, but its opposite are exactly the people this channel exists for. And if you want to understand how this exact logic, the logic that says the problem is not yet catastrophic enough to require intervention, produced another kind of disaster in another city, in another era. The video on the screen right now goes deeper into that pattern. Every word of it will feel familiar. Watch it now, before the algorithm sends you somewhere less important.